Please join me in welcoming Zanny Minton Beddoes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a very long introduction you read. I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. And thank you to the wonderful white hat volunteers. I don't think I've ever had such a stylish welcome, particularly at 11 p.m. last night, so many thanks. And Garth, I wish you hadn't shown that video, because I am now kicking myself for not spending longer. Fortunately, I have to leave later this afternoon, but this is my first visit to Calgary, and I certainly am sure it's not going to be my last. So many, many thanks for inviting me. And I've also been taking notes copiously. I wish I was going to be here for the rest of your conference, because I'm someone who spends, I think, too much of my life in airports. So I would love to listen to the deliberations you have during the rest of your conference, because it sounds, both for professional reasons and personal ones, very interesting. But what I hope to do in the next few minutes is kind of set the scene for your discussion by giving you a sort of quick whirlwind tour of my view of the world economy, in sort of two time frames, a kind of short-term one, which I guess is the next 6 months to a year, and then to offer you a few thoughts on where I think we're going in the longer term after that. The question, I guess, is we are about to hit the 4th anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which I think one can sort of date the beginning of the Great Recession to, the Great Global Recession. And the question is, have we sort of emerged from the shadow of that? And I think if you look around the world at the real economy, I think you have to conclude that we haven't really, and that the real economy around much of the world still looks in pretty precarious shape. If you look at the US, it's an economy, I think, stuck, certainly not in recession, but certainly not in a robust recovery. It's stuck in very low gear, and that low gear is not fast enough to bring the unemployment rate down. It's now still at 8.1%, and we heard last week that, 96,000 jobs were created in August? That's not enough to get the unemployment rate down again. It's a low gear economy right now. If we look across the Atlantic at Europe, we see that the Eurozone slipped back into technical recession. The periphery economies in Europe, as you know, are in terrible shape. Even the German economy, which had been doing great for a long time, is now slowing quite sharply. And notwithstanding the efforts of Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank to hold the Eurozone together, which I will talk about in some detail, I think the real economy in Europe doesn't look great. And then you look at the emerging world, and for the past few years, the emerging world has been the real bright spot. That's where you've gone to. You hop on a plane and you go to China, you go to India, you go to Brazil, and you were kind of invigorated by the pace of growth there, by the rapidity of change. And that's secularly still the case, but in cyclical terms, the emerging economies have slowed. I was just in China last week, and it's very clear that the economy has downshifted a gear or so. It's growing at somewhat below 8%, and people there are worried. People there are worried. You might think, from North America, what on earth are they worried about? 8% growth would be absolutely fantastic, but if you've been used to growing at 10, then 8 isn't so great, and you're worrying about it going down to 7 or 6. If you go to Brazil, the Brazilian economy has grown more slowly than the US economy over the past year. The Indian economy is growing at its slowest pace in 9 years. So I think you put all of that together, you have a world economy that is growing at its slowest pace since the Great Recession. It's not in recession, but it's really kind of truckling along at a not terribly impressive speed. But then if you look at financial markets, then you think, well, maybe we have escaped the shadow of the collapse of Lehman. The S&P 500 hit a 4-year high last week, as you know, and there's a great expectation that the central banks will come to the rescue again, that the Federal Reserve will provide more monetary easing this week, and that the European Central Bank is going to do enough to hold the euro together. And I think the big question is, do you follow Wall Street and think, well, actually, it's all going to be okay? Or do you look at the real economy and worry? And over the next sort of 6 months to a year, I worry, not that we're going to have something calamitous, but that we're going to have more of this very, very sluggish growth. And I think there is a risk that isn't particularly being taken into account enough, and that is political risk. Because if you look at the US, and I'm going to elaborate on this a bit more, I think the big questions over the next few months are political. They're clearly targeted around the election. The outcome of this election will have profound economic consequences. There's the fiscal cliff, which I'll talk about a bit, potentially a huge hit to a fragile US economy in the short term. If you look at Europe, I also think The ultimate question there is political. Will there be the political support to do what is necessary to hold the Eurozone together? And actually, paradoxically, the big question mark over China is also political. Because as you know, China is undergoing a big leadership transition in the next couple of months. And the question is, what will the Chinese leadership do to ensure that the economy doesn't slow down too much, or will they? And will they be able to kind of prevent what economists talk about as a hard landing? And so I think you put those three together, the big question marks over the next 6 months are really political, and your assessment of where they're going will feed into your view of where the economy goes. And just to elaborate on those three parts of the world in a bit more detail, let's just start with the US. And the US, the turnaround from the beginning of this year is a really striking one. If you think back, both financial markets and more broadly, there was quite a degree of optimism at the beginning of the year, that finally we'd turned the corner, the labor markets were improving, job growth was accelerating, corporate profits were at record highs. There was a sense that finally the corner had been turned, and much like in 2010 and 2011, optimism at the beginning of the year was dashed by about May or June, when the labor market numbers started coming in poorly again. And I think there's a sort of real sense of, oh my goodness, we've got yet another false start for this economic recovery. And I think that this time, things are a bit different for one important reason, which is that unlike 2010 and 2011, the US households, the US consumers, have actually made quite a lot of progress in paying down their debt burdens. It's not because they've been saving more, but quite a lot of mortgage debt has been written off. And, hangovers after financial crises are like any other hangover. Eventually, the headache goes away. And I think that that's gradually where we're getting to in the US case. I think that progress is being made at sort of working off the excesses. You see it in the housing market. I think there really is a good chance that the housing market is near a bottom at the US. And you can see not only new building, you see prices actually accelerating in some places. The worst of that sort of the bust after the 2007-2008 collapse, I think in the US is over. US banks are in very good shape. So I think that means that the sort of underlying economic prospects, even in the short term for the US, are better than they were a year ago or a year before that. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is weighing on corporate America. It's weighing on people. It's causing them to put off investment decisions. And what are those uncertainties? Well, the first one, which we may get some clarity of, and I think actually the least important one, is what will the central bank do? I suspect that the Federal Reserve will do make some more effort to try and loosen monetary conditions this week. I'm not terribly confident that it will make a huge difference. I think the really big domestic uncertainty is fiscal policy. And for those of you who are not from the US, the undercurrent policy, the US is heading for a very big set of tax increases at the end of this year because the temporary tax cuts that were introduced as part of the stimulus package expire, and also the Bush tax cuts of 2001 expire too. Those two together mean that there will, if there's nothing done, be a very big tax increase at the end of this year. There'll also be very big automatic spending cuts put in, because as part of the efforts to try and solve the US's medium-term fiscal mess last year, Congress tried to tie its hands by promising to put in place a huge across-the-board spending cut, which it now looks as though will happen unless there is some 11th hour agreement. This fiscal cliff is enough, if it's not kind of reversed very quickly, to push the economy back into recession at the beginning of next year. And it's already having an impact on investment decisions. It's certainly having an impact on decisions in the defense industry, because they don't know how big the cuts are going to be or when they're going to come in. And I think that most people in Washington, there is a general belief that somehow, at some point, the fiscal cliff will be sorted out. There's a hope that it will be done before the end of December. If not, that there'll be some retroactive agreement at the beginning of next year. But I think I worry that two things make me worry that it will go until the 11th hour or even beyond. The first is that if you look at the dynamic of the election campaign, there's clearly no chance of any agreement before the election campaign. And after the election campaign, it's not clear to me that either if the president loses or if he wins, there's going to be much desire to compromise in the short term. And secondly, there are very radical differences in the view of the state between the two sides. And regardless of what one thinks of them, that makes it harder to reach compromise in the short term. So while I think there will be a compromise or something will happen next year, I think we are kind of quite likely to go off the fiscal cliff, which in the short term could be a real hit for what is actually quite a weak economy. The other two shocks that could potentially worsen things in the US are the emerging markets and Europe. So let me briefly give you a sense of Europe. Europe obviously affects the rest of the world in two ways. Firstly, if the European economies are in recession, then that's less of a market to export to and probably a weaker euro. And secondly, and this has been the most important one, there's this fear that the euro will somehow break up, will collapse, and that fear has sort of held over and dampened financial markets around the world, that sort of fear of a Lehman Mark II, if you will. And I think the real question of this summer has been, has that risk, that second risk, risen or has it declined? And if you want to be optimistic, you look at the European Central Bank and you say that Mario Draghi, the Italian who leads the central bank, has in the last couple of months achieved a fairly dramatic breakthrough, which is convinced everybody on his board, bar the one German, to go along with a promise that the central bank made officially last week, that it would, for countries that are in some kind of official rescue program, it would buy their bonds. It would act as a lender of last resort. And the fact that the European Central Bank had not been able to be a lender of last resort was one of the big reasons that investors were fearful of holding Spanish or Italian government bonds. So if you want to be optimistic, you say this is a game change, this is a breakthrough, the European Central Bank is acting like, or has the capacity now to act as a real lender of last resort. We're beginning to go along the road which everyone pretty much agrees that Europe needs to do, which is to create the common economic institutions to underpin the euro. That's partly a lender of last resort, it's partly a common banking union, and it's partly some form of debt mutualization, some form of Hamilton moment, if you will, for Europe. And you can also say, well, the European Commission this week is coming out with proposals for a banking union, and so maybe in its sort of tentative European way, the Eurozone is moving in that direction. And that's possible. But I also want to argue that over the past few weeks, in fact, at exactly the same time as this has been happening in Frankfurt with the European Central Bank, I think the political dynamic in certain parts of Europe is worrying and becoming worryingly against that kind of integration. And let me just point to three areas, and with Yanis here on the podium, I'm slightly reluctant to talk about Greece since I'm talking about a country that you know much, much, much more about. But it seems to me that Greece, which is obviously where the euro crisis started and the country which is in the toughest shape and has the toughest road ahead, Greece cannot possibly fulfill the demands of the current rescue plan that it has. So there has to be some renegotiation of this plan. There has to be some relaxation of the demands that the European rescuers have made of Greece. And the question is whether the Germans, particularly, German politics, will allow its leaders to do that. And I think that Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, is very keen to give the Greek government more time. But if you look at German opinion polls, with all due respect, the Germans are basically fed up of Greece. And the proportions of Germans who are against more money, more assistance for Greece is rising very sharply. And so I think that is sort of one first point to worry about. Second point I'd mention is a country like Italy, a core country in many ways of the European project, where Silvio Berlusconi, the former prime minister, is trying to make a political comeback on the back of an anti-Euro, anti-German kind of platform. And he is kind of weighing into popular discontent. And there's this sort of view that the Italians are fed up with the Germans telling them what to do. There's a sort of national pride, and they don't want the Germans telling them what to do. And who knows how far he'll get, but the sort of appeal of that, I think, is worrying. And then the third area I'd point to is Germany itself. And I'm half German, so I read the German press, and German is my first language, and I'm sort of struck when I read the German press at how popular Germany, sort of the man on the street in Germany, thinks of this whole Euro crisis as a whole load of profligate Southerners in Europe, again with respect, whom the Germans are bailing out. And it's an entirely erroneous, or at least largely erroneous, reading of events, because it's not just that. There's been a loss of confidence in the whole euro as a single currency. But nonetheless, the sort of narrative in Germany is, we're being called upon to bail these people out, and we're fed up of it. And I think that political narrative, although probably not shared by the German Chancellor, kind of butts up against the desire of the European Central Bank to move more towards joint liability, towards being a kind of real lender of last resort. And at some point in the next few months, these two different visions are going to clash. And either the sort of citizenry of Northern Europe, particularly the German citizenry, has to be kind of convinced that greater integration, greater mutual liability is the way forward, or I think you're going to be unable to go down that route and we're going to have yet another blow up in the euro crisis. And it may not happen next month. There may be a lot of sort of enthusiasm and there may be a lot of sense that things are getting better for the next few months. But against the backdrop of very weak economies, over the next 9 months, next year, I think we're going to have at least another kind of crisis drama moment in Europe. I can't believe, the game has changed so much that it's all over. So Europe, still worry about it. Maybe, not next week, but still worry. What about the emerging economies? They're the big question, and I think the most important question is China going to have a hard landing? Is the Chinese economy on a trajectory towards a slowdown much bigger than it's had in the recent past? Because China is what underpins commodity prices. China is what underpins a lot of growth in other emerging economies. And if China were really heading for a sudden slowdown, a very hard landing, I think the world economy is in serious trouble. Fortunately, I don't think it is. And I think that's one area where conventional wisdom outside China is often too pessimistic. I think there are 3 reasons often given for why China might be in real trouble. One is that it's going to have a property bust, and look what happened in the US when you had a property bust, the economy is going to collapse. Well, China has actually had a property bust. There has been, prices have come down and sales have slowed a lot at the top end of the Chinese market. There's a very big difference between property in China and property in the US, and that's the lack of leverage. There's no such thing as a ninja loan in China. When you buy an apartment, you put down 40% cash, 50% cash. There isn't this link between property prices and the broader financial system. And so even if there is a further bust in property prices, it's not going to fell the whole economy. The second area that people worry about is local governments. After 2009, when China went on a huge infrastructure spending binge, a lot of this was financed through local governments, and while much of that infrastructure, and certainly all the airport infrastructure, was absolutely necessary, there was a lot of infrastructure whose economic merit is probably questionable. And there are a lot of projects that are probably not going to turn out to be viable, and a lot of local governments will have losses, and they will need to be bailed out. But again, the difference between China and, say, the US or many advanced economies is that China's overall government fiscal health is very good. It's got a very low debt load. It can perfectly well do that. And so even if you have a huge local government financial problem, the central government has the capacity to sort it out. I think China does have issues, and certainly the political uncertainty is one, and the other is how it transforms its economy away from being one focused so much on investment and exports, but particularly investment, towards being an economy more focused on domestic consumption. But you can't help going there and thinking they are making this transition. It's taking time. It's going to mean slower growth than they've had in the past. But every time I go to China, I leave more optimistic than I arrived, because this transition is happening. And so I just don't see a strong likelihood of a real slump in China in the short term, which by extension makes me think that there is unlikely to be a sort of calamitous collapse in the rest of the emerging world. It's going to be slower growth than we've been used to, but it's not going to be calamitous. So you put all of that together, and I think you get an outcome of something much like what we've got at the moment in the short term. A lot of uncertainty politically and sort of rather feeble economic growth. What about kind of take off the immediate hat and move a little bit more to sort of the 2, 3, 4, 5-year horizon? And I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to do this quite quickly, but three thoughts to decide, perhaps to provoke you with. The first is that I think if you look at the rich world, the advanced world, the US is going to be by far the best surprise. The US economy is going to do much better, I think, over the medium term than many of its detractors think. It's going to be, as someone put it, the least dirty shirt in the laundry basket. It's going to, there are very good reasons, I think, why the US on a medium-term scenario is in pretty good shape. It's partly because this hangover that I described is coming to an end and will come to an end over the next few years. Secondly, structurally, the US economy is adjusting. And to put it crudely, it's moving from an economy that spent the 90s, or the latter part of the 90s and certainly to the 2000s, as being one fueled by investment in housing and then consumption, to being one that is much more fueled by investment and exports. And it's striking that exports have contributed a larger fraction of growth in this recovery, however weak it's been, than in previous ones. And it's not just that exports themselves are strong, but that the composition of exports is shifting towards, for example, higher value-added services, the kinds of companies that are exporting. And this, I'm sure, matters for all of the traffic that comes through your airports. The new kinds of companies are exporting that have never exported before. Small companies, far more small companies are exporting, and I think that's a trend that's going to last. And then finally, of course, and you know, I'm not quite sure how one says this in Calgary, center, of course, of an energy revolution, but the shale gas revolution in the US is going to change and is changing the dynamics not only of energy in the US, but of manufacturing more broadly. It's going to cut a lot of manufacturing costs. And so you put all of that together, and I think you have the ingredients of a dynamic and very new kind of economy. And I think certainly compared to other advanced economies, anywhere in Europe, again, with respect, I don't think can compete with this. I think that whether it's Japan, whether it's the rest of Europe, Canada is in good shape, but North America broadly is, within the advanced world, clearly looking better than everywhere else. Second, somewhat provocative statement, which leads on, I guess, from what I've just said, is that compared to the last decade, I think the growth rates in the emerging world over the next few years are going to disappoint you. It's not that the underlying story about the emerging economies is where the growth is wrong. They're still going to grow faster than the advanced world, don't get me wrong. But I think that the days of double-digit growth year after year in countries like India, I think are over for the time being. And I think they're over because a lot of that growth in the 2000s turned out to be unsustainable, because, in part because as China shifts to more domestic consumption, its demand for raw materials is going to grow more slowly, and so the commodity boom, though it's going to continue, is going to be less crazy. Secondly, countries like Brazil have seen a lot of their growth build on the back of very, very fast domestic credit growth. As huge numbers of people are brought into the middle class for the first time, domestic credit growth has soared. Again, the trend will continue, but not the pace. The pace has to slow. You can't carry on at that pace. India, I think, is going to be hobbled by too little investment in infrastructure. If you go to India, it's got a great new airport, or a great new terminal in Delhi Airport, but the whole problem is, they had the biggest power cuts in the world this year when half the country lost power for 2 days. They simply haven't got the infrastructure to keep up the growth rates that they've been seeing. And I think you put all of that together and you'll see a few years of slightly slower growth in the emerging world. And so the hubris around the BRICS and the absolute ever-rising BRICS will, I think, somewhat dampen in the next few years. And a final thought to leave you with, which I think is relevant when you think about the chances of having greater public investment in infrastructure. The competition for government funds in an era of austerity is obviously going to be huge. And I think we're going to see in both advanced and emerging worlds a political dynamic that is very focused on austerity, but also on redistribution or distributional questions. I think it's telling, and I've just finished writing a large report on inequality around the world. 2/3 of people in the world, 2/3 of the world's citizens live in countries where the gap between rich and poor has risen substantially in the last 30 years. Now, you don't have to worry, you don't have to be a kind of redistributionist, you don't have to be an egalitarian particularly, and I'm not, to think that the political dynamic that unleashes is going to be a large part of the next few years' policy framework. I think at a time of sluggish growth in the rich world, widening inequality means that people at the bottom and even at the middle see their absolute incomes decline. I think that's clearly the sort of dynamic we find ourselves in as the backdrop to the election campaign in the US. And I think it's also going to be high on the agenda in Europe. And for different reasons, if you go to China, if you go to India, popular concern right now is about the huge accretion of wealth to the top through crony capitalism, through resources being shifted from the state into private hands, through the close links between big business and government. And so this whole question of distribution, which I think hasn't been part of the broad public policy agenda, in many ways thankfully, but hasn't been part of the broad public agenda for a long time, is coming back. And it's a striking parallel, I think, to 100 years ago, to the aftermath of the first Gilded Age in North America. And I think we see ourselves in the emerging world in a similar kind of moment historically. So, for example, if you look at last week, we had a big cover story in The Economist on the building of the Asian welfare states. The Asian governments, traditionally focused on growth, on boosting growth, there's a huge push to create public health care, to invest in public safety nets, dramatic changes taking place, which, whatever your political viewpoint, are going to change those economies. And I think in the rich world, even more complicatingly, that takes place against a backdrop of slower growth and the need for budget austerity. So the question of who gets what is going to be a large part of the policy dynamic and the policy dialogue going forward. And to conclude, the country that actually is in the best shape to deal with that is the US, because the US has a medium-term fiscal deficit problem, but it has two big advantages. The first is that it has the world's most inefficient tax system. I mean, I exaggerate slightly, but an incredibly inefficient tax system. So you can have an enormous amount of gain simply by making the tax system more efficient. And secondly, it needs to have entitlement reform. And I think that anyone who looks at the outlook for the US sees that you have to do something on the revenue side and you have to have entitlement reform. And it's a much easier challenge than that faced by, I think, any country in Europe. It's a much, much easier thing to do. But the issue right now is that neither side in the political debate, and I'm not going to make any political judgments, but it's just a simple matter of fact, that neither side is taking on that holistically. One side, to caricature, wants to raise taxes and not do very much to entitlements, and one side wants to cut taxes and cut entitlements. And I think that if you put reasonable people in a room and told them they can't leave until you've come up with a medium-term budget plan, people would come up with one that had some elements of both. And when that is done, if you add that to all the other advantages that the US has, when and if that's done, I think the medium-term trajectory for the US looks pretty good. If it isn't, it doesn't look so good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zanny, for those insightful, thoughtful remarks, and I'm sure your comments have provoked lots of questions from the audience. And